Now I'm talking to Phil Benson. Phil, how do you determine reasonable rates with a client, and how do you balance the winning the project with maintaining adequate margins on the project?
In order to do all of that, to determine reasonable rates and manage the negotiation process, you really need to think about several elements. What does it cost us to do the work? What are the client's other choices in the marketplace? And how are we differentiated from all those other choices? Are we better than them, or are we just run-of-the-mill, one of the same? And how does the client approach negotiations? A common mistake is to think only about our costs and desired margins, but to negotiate effectively, you really have to put yourself in the client's shoes. Ultimately, the space where a deal can be made is when we compare favorably to the other choices in terms of the value we provide and in terms of our rates. If we provide higher value than our competitors, we can often get higher rates, but if we don't provide higher value, we won't be able to, or we likely will not be able to get rates that are higher than the client's other choices. Another important item to understand is the client's negotiation style. Are they collaborative? And by that I mean, they're really looking for a win-win, or are they more positional and don't mind winning at your expense? I also call that confrontational. You need to be prepared for the negotiation process based on those attributes and based on our positioning. And I've kind of seen the following patterns in the negotiations I've been involved with. With collaborative clients, where we do provide higher value, we can often lead and drive the negotiation process, and we'll likely get a fair deal and can often influence the rates. Where the client is more collaborative, but we're not really differentiated from our competitors, we can still get a fair deal, but you have to be really careful not to overplay your hands, because it's really easy to have the negotiations break down and they go to other choices. One of the more interesting ones is when when the client's confrontational, but we provide higher value than our competitors. Then you have to be prepared for a more positional, more confrontational negotiation, and you have to be ready to stick to your guns, but not make it personal. One of the things I've done is allow time for the client to figure out that they don't have better choices, so she'll try to take it slow. And then if the client's confrontational and you don't provide higher value, you're not differentiated, you're really negotiating from a position of weakness, and you probably won't get as fair a deal as you want to. Finally, the other element we have to talk about is our costs. If we're squeezed on rates, it's important to maintain flexibility in how we cost the job. Don't tie billing rates into internal per diem codes where you're locked in on a staff level being a certain rate. Escalate staff categories for billing as much as defensible. If there's minimum criteria provided, use the minimum criteria. Don't over-propose people where you propose them at higher criteria than the minimum really calls for. And if you do this, you can manage your costs and still get reasonable margins, even if you're in a competitive negotiating environment.
Phil, what do you do when the client wants to negotiate or insist on negotiating rates and you haven't seen the terms and conditions or haven't negotiated the final terms and conditions of the deal?
That's a good one. And I kind of split it into two potential scenarios. One for the scenario where the client is negotiating rates prior to us seeing the terms, and one when the client's negotiating rates and we've seen the terms but we don't agree with them. And I kind of differentiate those. Where we haven't seen the terms, first step is ask to see them before submitting a rate proposal. If the client resists, I think telling them that the rates and the terms are linked, and consider increasing your rate proposal to account for this uncertain risk. And in some cases, you may even tell the client you're doing that and let them know that they're not necessarily getting your best deal because they haven't resolved the term issue or they're keeping the term issue secret. I think it's, as in the previous question, I think it's important to understand your client's choices and how we compare to them. If we really are their best choice, we have more room for negotiations than if there are numerous other firms who can provide the same level of service and expertise as we can. In the case where we've seen the terms and have not agreed with them, you have to decide whether the terms and questions can be mitigated with increased margins or not. If they can, then I think you're back to the same scenario of increasing your rate proposal and then playing rates off of terms during the negotiating process. If they can't, you almost have to insist and maybe even refuse to negotiate rates until the terms in question are resolved. Again, how firm you can be depends on your position and depends on what other choices they have.
Phil, do you ever do free work, and under what conditions do you do free work?
I don't know. Sometimes I think we tend to do way too much free work in this company. But there is a place for free work in a place where it can be considered and it be a reasonable choice to make. I often consider free work to be the equivalent of a business development expenditure. However, it does have the added liabilities that you may be producing a deliverable and the client may use that deliverable for something, and so you actually have some added liability. So ideally, free work wouldn't have a deliverable that could make their way into other uses, but could take the form of advice, workshops, things that assist the client developing a project without leaving a tangible work product. Now, you do need to follow quality and QC and senior review processes, even with free work, and treat it like a real project and make sure you don't get in trouble there. Now, if you can resolve the liability issues, then I think free work looks more like any other business development expenditure. How much does it cost? What's the margin that may be realized from the investment? And what is the potential for that margin to be realized? So, if you think you can get 10 times the investment in margin and there's a 50% chance that you're going to get it, maybe it's a reasonable thing to do. But I think you end up comparing that investment with other business development investments you're considering doing, even though it may not come out of the same accounts.